What happens when you do and do not obey God? That's the story of church history, and that's what we're here to talk about today. Now, we'll cover three basic sections of time during my period of the discussion today. Persecuted Christianity, Imperial Christianity, and then primarily the Dark Ages happened through a time we call Christendom. So let's discuss this, and what you're going to find as we talk about these things from history is that this truly was the vineyard of Jesus' warning, "By their fruits ye shall know them." You know, corruption began early in the New Testament. The young church was not immune from any of this. There was moral corruption in the young church to the point that people were getting drunk at the Lord's table in Corinth. Now, can you imagine that happening today? It was terrible. They had doctrinal corruption, such as the Judaizers and the Gnostics, that required even the apostles to give their word about these things specifically. And even with word from the apostles, these doctrines did not stop. You know, I've got a list up here on your board of many of the false things that were happening in the church in the very first centuries. Larry read a passage for us out of Thessalonians where Paul said there would be a great falling away. Paul said, even now, the mystery of iniquity is already at work. Now, what that means is this: the root was already growing. The seed had germinated, and the things that were going to take the church into apostasy and take the church away from God's original plan had already begun during the lifetime of the apostles. So let's get right into it and talk about some of these things that happened. The very first section of time we're going to consider is the period of persecuted Christianity. That is when the church was persecuted but was primarily pure. There were some heresies that brought their heads up during this time, but they weren't things that affected the church in a large scale. The first thing we want to notice about this period of time was that there was intense persecution. Did you know that there were 10 Roman emperors who tortured and killed our brethren during the first 300 years of the church? It was a very difficult time to be a Christian as far as persecution goes. But even during this persecution, there was tremendous spread of Christianity. By the end of the 4th century, Christianity had spread throughout the entire Roman Empire, and they say fully 10% of the Roman Empire were Christians, even under this very difficult time. Yet not long after this, we find that false doctrines began to spread their tentacles out throughout the church, and there was a man who gives us the first look at the apostasy that would come. This man's name was Ignatius. And according to history, we find that this man was appointed by the Apostle Paul as a bishop in the church at Antioch in 69 A.D. Now, being a bishop in Antioch came with a lot of influence because Antioch was a very well-known and recognized church. And this man was concerned about heresy. And he had a great concern that many of us today have. How do we keep the church pure? The Gnostics were coming up on one side, the Judaizers somewhere else. You had the Marcionites, and the Ebionites, and the Ophites, and so many other things that we could talk about. And he said, how do we keep the church pure? And his solution was we take one man out of the bishops or the elders or the presbyters, and we put him above the congregation, and we make him the sole bishop of the church. Now, Ignatius of Antioch taught this doctrine in his writings. Ignatius of Antioch, though, didn't get this idea established firmly during his lifetime. It didn't really become the vogue for about 200 years later. But by the time that we get to our next period of time, you have not only bishops over a congregation, but you have them having influence over congregations around them. And even further than that, you'd have an archbishop over a geographical area with a lot of churches in it. And then you had men above that, and men above that. Ultimately, you had 5 cities who had men they called patriarchs who were in charge of the 5 major areas of the world at the time. And they all would give report and give homage to the one man who became the head of the church here on this earth. You know, we talk about the rise of the Catholic Church, and that was a part of my topic when it was given to me. When you study the history of the Catholic Church, it's kind of like studying a snowball while it's rolling downhill. I mean, it depends on where you take your snapshot on what you see. When you and I open the newspaper or look at the news today and we see headlines about a Catholic Church that systematically protects and shields and excuses child molesting priests, we're disgusted. And I want to say rightly so. I believe many good Catholics are disgusted by that too. But you need to understand that these things didn't just happen in a vacuum. These things happened with 1,500 years of corruption behind them. It was a long, slow process. You know, you and I would have had actually a lot in common with Christians in the 300s. It wouldn't have been something very, very different from us. They worshiped and had many of the same understandings and beliefs that you and I do. The wholesale corruption of the doctrines of salvation didn't occur till many, many years after this. Catholicism began with this departure in the sense of church government. Taking one man and giving him authority that belongs only to God is always a problem. And something interesting about history, you've heard people say history repeats itself. It does. I know there are many in this audience today who've seen situations like this, where one man had the authority over a congregation, and many times that one man would take his orders from people in other places. And I want you to understand that that always produces the same corruption. It always does, and it's always displeasing to God. Let's move on to our next period of time, 312 to 590, the time of Imperial Christianity. Now, why 312 to 590? Well, in 311, there was a Roman emperor named Galerius who finally decided, you know, we've tried 300 years and we just can't stomp these guys out. Let's just tolerate them. And he issued an edict of toleration. That was a law that says we'll just put up with Christians. When he died, there was a man named Constantine who comes into power. But before that happens, we find that this emperor who had decided he would tolerate Christianity would ultimately become the leader of the Christian church here on earth. Now, how does that happen? You know, what happened ultimately is they had the leadership of the church united in one man with the leadership of the government. Now, what we're fixing to have is an election here in the United States. Wouldn't it be a shame if we were having to choose between George Bush and John Kerry to be the head of the church? Somebody said, man, that's in to chill through you. We'd had Bill Clinton head of the church for 8 years. Wouldn't that have been something? Somebody said, what a mess we'd get into. And that's true. We would. Because anytime you put a man as head of God's church, you have problems. And that's what began to develop here. You see, in the early years of the Roman Empire, when an emperor died, his son didn't take over. It worked kind of like the mafia. All the top generals would fight, and the last one standing was the new emperor. And when this man Galerius died, there were two generals who began to fight. One's named Maxentius, the other Constantine, and they met for a battle, winner take all, at the bridge of Milvian, just outside the city of Rome. If you were there, you'd have put your money on Maxentius, because he had an army of 170,000 people. Constantine, on the other side, had an army of 40,000. Now, how the Roman Church and the Christianity, visible Christianity on this earth, came to be under the Roman Emperor happened in a short span of 15 years. And it's not like all these other things we're talking about that took years and years and years. This is a story of one man and one battle and something that he thought he saw one evening. Because on the way to this battle, Constantine believed that he saw a vision in the sky. He saw a cross up in the sky, and underneath it were the words, "In this sign you shall conquer." He took that to mean that the Christian God would give him victory. And he rallied his troops, and I want you to understand they gained a tremendous victory. So Constantine, once he became the emperor, took toleration a step further, and he said, we're going to protect and we're going to provide for this Christian religion. We're going to lift it up, and his wife becomes a Christian. His children were raised as Christians. Constantine himself was baptized as a Christian, and after his baptism refused to wear royal purple, but was even buried in his white baptismal gown because of his commitment to this Christian God. And things progress very, very quickly. After him, a man named Theodosius comes on the scene as an emperor, and he makes it even illegal to be a pagan. And he would round up the pagans at sword point, drive them to the river, and make them walk through the river, baptizing them, and as he said, making Christians out of them. Can you imagine that? You know, there's an aspect of this Imperial Christianity that drastically affects the world we live in today. And that aspect is that the church government began to emulate the government of Rome. No longer was it one bishop over a congregation, but now the Roman emperor was head of the church. And the way that happened was Constantine, when you join the church and state, if there's a problem in the church, you've got a problem in the state. So Constantine, whenever there was a heresy that came up that caused much dissension, he'd call all the bishops in and lock everybody in a room and say, we're not leaving until this is settled. And they'd debate, and then they'd have a vote, and those that lost the vote were excommunicated as heretics, and the doctrine of the church was the ones that won. And he'd send them back out. And you had the Roman emperor, the head of the church. You had those under them and all the way down to the bishops and those over individual congregations who would carry this official doctrine of the church. During this period of time, people weren't converted to Jesus. They were coerced into Christianity. And you know when that happens, people come with all of their corruption and their vices. If we made a law today in Eureka Springs that everybody here had to be members of the church and be at church tomorrow morning, can you imagine the mess we'd have? And that's what happened. It was an ungodly mess. The church was at this time in large a bigamous church. They tried to be married to Christ and married to the state. And that does not happen. You had tares among the wheat, as Jesus talked about. Now I have to mention there are 6 things that just have to be said about this papacy, and that's the arisal of the Pope. 6 things that are against God's Word about this. The very first thing is that Jesus Christ, as Justin has mentioned to us, is the only head of the church. There is no man and never will be a man who can be head of the church. Number 2, Jesus said, the greatest shall be least and the least shall be greatest. That's not the way the Roman church works. It conflicts with New Testament church government. There was no church government above the local congregation in the New Testament. It conflicts with the New Testament view of Peter as one who denied Christ and described himself as an elder in 1 Peter chapter 5. And it's a gross abuse of Matthew 16, where Jesus said, thou art Peter, and upon this rock I shall build my church. You've heard that used to defend having a pope, haven't you? But Jesus actually said to Peter in the Greek, thou art Petros, and upon Petra I will build my rock, or my church. Those are different words. And I want you to know that there's never a man in God's Word called the Petra. It was always Jesus. No other foundation can any man lay than that which is laid, Jesus Christ. 1 Corinthians chapter 3. Christ Himself is the chief cornerstone, Ephesians 2. Jesus Christ is the living stone, 1 Peter chapter 2. There is no one but Jesus is the foundation of this church. And there's nothing in the New Testament of apostolic succession. There's no indication that they passed their offices down. And I might note right here that in every age there were many good and godly people who opposed these corruptions. And when we talk about the church, we're talking about God's people. And there were many good, godly people who opposed these things. Now let's look at the age of Christendom. We call it Christendom just like we talk about a kingdom. A kingdom is the area where a king has dominion. Well, Christendom was the establishment of the rule of Christ, they said. Christ having dominion, not just spiritually, but militarily and politically as well. There was no religious freedom during this age, and it began with Gregory the Great, who was the first pope. And it lasts until 1517, when you have an angry German monk named Martin Luther, who nails 95 protests to the door of his church in Wittenberg, Germany. And David will talk about those things. How did this happen? How did Christendom rule Europe for 1,000 years? Well, the first thing is that the Western Roman Empire fell. It fell to barbarian tribes such as the Huns, the Lombards, the Goths, the Franks, and many others. And they were politically uncivilized. It wasn't a big invasion of one nation over another, but it was just a crumbling of the empire. And they set up all these many different little tribally controlled areas, and eventually one man comes to have a lot of influence in this area. There are two important cities at this point. There was Rome in the west. They had spiritual authority in the Pope, but they had no clout, no military clout, because Constantine had moved the capital of the empire over to Constantinople, or Constantinople, as we would call it today. Today it's Istanbul. And that's where the government was, and that's where the military power was. So you had this division of power in this empire now. Rome had dictates, but he did not have any muscle to enforce his dictates. So you had this empire of Christianity, or kingdom of God they were trying to establish, that was really struggling and on hold. But there was tremendous corruption. A man named Clovis comes up, and he unites the Franks and captures many of the tribal areas around and builds a kingdom we call the Frankish kingdom. And he was not overly powerful, but as he died, he turned his kingdom over to his children, and they bickered and fought, and another guy comes to have tremendous power, and he was called the mayor of the palace. Kind of like in England, there's a queen, and she's just a figurehead, but the real power is in the prime minister, John Major. Well, that's the way it was during this kingdom of the Franks. And this mayor of the palace was a guy by the name of Charles Martel. They called him Charles the Hammer. And that was even back before WWF. He was a man of great, great power. Great power militarily. He was a great leader. And I tell you what, if it wasn't for this man, you and I very likely today would be speaking Arabic. Because in the 600s, there was a man who rose up. He was an Arab camel driver named Muhammad, and he said that he had a vision from God. And in this vision, he learned that it was the Arab and not the Jew who was heir of God's people. It was Ishmael and not Isaac, the Quran that he would write and not the Bible. It was Allah and not Jehovah, Muhammad and not Jesus. And he introduced a doctrine called jihad that we've heard a lot about recently, hasn't he? That's holy war. And they believed in holy war. And they swept all across northern Africa and swept up into Spain, and they were poised to take all of Europe if it hadn't been for Charles Martel. And he took an army down to Spain, and in 732 he stopped them. And that was the end of the great expansion of the Muslim faith and their try to rule the world at that time. But his grandson, Charles the Great, is a guy that would have been a 20-point question on your history exam in high school. His name was Charlemagne. You've heard of Charlemagne. He was a tremendous military leader, even above his grandfather, Charles the Great. He conquered the Bavarians, the Slavs, the Muslims, and he was such a military force that the Pope, sitting off down in Italy, looks and he realizes, this guy's my muscle. If I can hook up with him, we've got somebody who can force people to do what I say. And you know, sure enough, they did that. On Christmas Day in 800 A.D., Charlemagne knelt before Pope Leo III, and he placed a crown on Charlemagne's head and proclaimed him Charles, most pious of God, crowned Augustus by God. Now, you recognize the word Augustus, don't you? That was the name of the very first Roman emperor. And they said they were reviving the Roman Empire, and they called it the Holy Roman Empire, and it was not holy. But this was the empire that was ruled. The church had now basically hired muscle. And they had the double-edged sword. They had the edicts of the Pope, and they had the muscle of Charlemagne, and they could have ruled the world for centuries. But in fact, you know what happens? These two positions, the Pope and the King, become enemies and rivals, and they fight for the next 500 years on the battlefield that you and I call the Dark Ages. And that's what the Dark Ages were about, this struggle between the Pope and the King to rule. When Charlemagne dies, he divides the kingdom among his children, and this gave rise to what you and I think of when we talk about the Middle Ages or the medieval times. King Arthur, the castles and knights and ladies and lords and serfs and vassals. All that stuff that you see at the restaurant there in Dallas called medieval times and the jousting. That all happened during this time. There were men who were military leaders in their own area, and they would rise up and conquer an area that wasn't real big, and they would all give allegiance to the king, yet in their domain they were the lord over all of their land. We call it a feudal system because the Latin word for feud means fee. And fee means to pay. And these men were lord over land, and they charged everyone in that area to live on their land. You had to pay rent, as it were. They were the first landlords, so to speak. Now, if you were in a church that was ruled, or in an area that was ruled by one of these landlords, they required you to pay money to them to be a church. And if you wanted to preach in that church, you had to pay money to this lord to be able to preach in that church. That would be like me in Denton having to go to the mayor of Denton and pay him money to have the freedom to preach in the church in Denton. And it was the rise of what they called lay investiture, and this was the source of a lot of problems during this period of time, this lay investiture. You see, the authority of lay investiture meant somebody who was not in the clergy, someone who was in the laity, someone who wasn't many times even a Christian, would appoint those who were leaders of the churches. And you know, when you get that happening, there's so much corruption can be involved in that. And the leadership of the church was up for sale. Friends, and sometimes you'd have men who would buy leadership in many different congregations and many different offices because there was a lot of money and power in those positions. Now, friends, this was a terrible thing. It brought tremendous ungodliness into the church. And they called it simony, was actually the word they had for it. And eventually 300 French monasteries rebel against this. And they said, instead of this happening, what should happen is the state should get their power from God. And the Pope said, you know, that's a good idea. This Pope's name was Hildebrand, called himself Gregory VII. And he declared that simony was illegal and that Henry IV was guilty of simony, he was king at the time. And he said, we're going to stop it. And Henry IV calls his own council and he says, oh no, you're not even worthy to be Pope. And they were going to shut it down. There was a lot of discussion about what would happen. Would he take his armies in there? And now it's important for you to understand just a few of these doctrines that affected the church at this time. And I want to say many of these are still official Catholic doctrine today. And these all had in focus one thing. And that one thing was the absolute power of the church. That's what they were striving for. Number one, they taught that Jesus Christ was fierce. He was angry and mean, and you had to be afraid of Him because He wanted to send you to hell. And because of that, people were afraid of Jesus. So they taught people to bow before relics and icons, to pray to the saints. And you know, there's nobody any nicer than Mommy, is there? So they all began to go to Mary, because she could go to Jesus and she was nice. Another thing that they built was something called sacerdotalism. We call it a clergy system today. And that is where you have God in the heavens and you have you and I down below, and in between us stands the bishop. And he was between you and God. You had no access to God. And they presented something called sacramentalism, 7 sacraments, and these were the only ways you could have grace. The only way you could have any grace was through these 7 things. They were baptism, the Eucharist, which was communion, and part of that was transubstantiation. They taught the bread and the wine actually become body, flesh, and blood of Jesus Christ. There was confirmation, orders, marriage, extreme unction, which were your last rites, and penance. I wish we had time to talk about these. But another thing that they did is they established firmly the idea of papal infallibility. That means the Pope is never wrong when he speaks from the chair. The term is ex cathedra. And he never makes a mistake when he's speaking from the chair. He has the words of God at this time. To build that up and to hold that up, they had what's called the Inquisition. You've heard of the Spanish Inquisition. What they did is they hunted heretics. And they defined a heretic as anyone who willfully and persistently contradicted the Pope or official teaching of the Church. And they would put them on trial before a tribunal, and they would convict them and turn them over to the state, who would then execute them, burn them at the stake or something else, as heretics during that time. They also introduced the doctrine of purgatory. Now, the doctrine of purgatory was this: nobody's good enough to go to heaven when they die. None of us. And what's so devious about this is that Jesus Christ, they teach, His death paid only for the guilt of sin, but it didn't pay for the punishment. You have to pay the punishment yourself. So you could go to heaven, but you still had to go to purgatory first, which had the literal fires of hell burning, but you didn't have to stay there forever. That was the difference in purgatory and hell. And the way you didn't have to stay in purgatory forever is you could do penance. Penance is good deeds that you could do to shorten the period of time that you had to stay in purgatory. And you'd go to the priest and say, "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned." And he would decide what your sin was worth. And he'd tell you, well, you have to pay this much money and you have to do this much community service and do these Hail Marys, and then that'll shorten your time in purgatory for this. That gave rise to the sale of indulgences. The sale of indulgences went like this. One good deed you can do is give money to the church. And I think that would be an appropriate thing you could do for this crime that you have done to lessen your time in purgatory. So just give money to sin or to the church for the sins you've committed. And it got to the point where people would even say, well, can I give money for sins I might commit in the future? Can you imagine the money that college kid would spend before spring break? Terrible. But that really happened. And they would take money for sins people would commit in the future. They would take money for sins that your mother or father had committed so you could help get them out of purgatory more quickly. The most famous salesman of these indulgences was a man named John Tetzel. He had a saying. He would say, "When a coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs." He would say things that were despicable that we laugh about today. He would say stuff like, "How can you sit there with money in your pocket while your dearly departed mother writhes in the flames of eternal hell because you don't love her enough to spend a little money to get her out of purgatory?" I'm telling you, it was terrible. One of my favorite stories, and this may run me over on time a little bit, but I've got to tell it. There was a nobleman that came to one of these things, and he asked John Tetzel, "Can I buy forgiveness for a sin I'm going to commit in the future?" And he said, "You sure can, but you got to pay right now." So he forked over the money. After John Tetzel was through in that city, he headed out of town, and this nobleman was hiding in the bushes. And he jumped out, and he just beat the thunder out of John Tetzel and took all of his money. And he said, "This is the sin I had in mind." You know why people felt that way is because it was terrible. It was terrible and ungodly. At this point, power had replaced piety, tradition over truth, and the Pope's words over God's words. Now, you remember that standoff that we were talking about a moment ago between the king and the Pope? You want to know how that ended? The Pope won. You know how he won? He won with something called a papal interdiction. The king said, "We're going to withdraw or kick you out." And the Pope said, "No, you're not. And I'm going to order a papal interdiction," which means the priests quit doing any of the sacraments. Now you have to remember, a sacrament is the only way you can get grace from God. And if the priest won't give you communion, you have no way to save your soul. You can have no grace from God. Now friends, when I think about this, I think, why did they put up with that? I wouldn't put up with that, would you? Of course not. But you have to understand that these people were ignorant. They couldn't read. They couldn't write. You had never seen a Bible. You never laid eyes on one. The only man you knew who could read was the priest. And the priest told you everything. You didn't sing at church. Their church services were in Latin. You didn't read God's Word. You didn't sing. You didn't even take communion. When you came to communion, there was an iron railing between you and the priest. And the communion was behind the priest. And he would take it and say magic words over it and turn it into the body of Jesus. And then he would take a wafer and put it on your little tongue, and you didn't touch it. How can you argue? You can't argue. And what this man said, this Pope said to the king, is he said, "I will send your entire nation to hell if you don't do what I say." And when you get a point that you've got a man who can send people to hell, or they believe he can, you've got absolute power of superstition. And friends, it was the Dark Ages for a reason. It was a terrible, terrible time. He humiliated Pope Henry IV, made him stand in the snow outside his summer home for 3 days. He wrote in his memoirs about how he mocked and humiliated this king. And for the next several hundred years, this Pope had ultimate authority in the church. And I'll leave you with that.